Before we start, here's the principles of design I'll be mentioning in this video. So at the time of recording, Girls Frontline 2's global release is expected to be later this week, around December 3rd. With that in mind, I thought I'd go look back on the original mobile game. Girls Frontline was developed by the Shanghai-based Mica team, also known as Sunborn, and released in mainland China in 2016. Subsequent releases in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and South Korea followed in 2017, with a Japanese and global English version released in 2018. The game takes place in the very near future, where sentient AI-piloted androids known as dolls are the norm. Almost indistinguishable from humans, they can be your maid, run your bar, or go on a date with you, and many other things. Most importantly, for the purposes of the game and this video, they can also fight. Oh yeah, the treatment of dolls and how strong their rights are is a messy matter, and not necessarily something we have time for, so... In Girls Frontline, you play as a rookie commander under the mercenary company Griffin and Kruger, and command a contingent of tactical dolls. Each of these dolls is uniquely specialized in a specific firearm and uses it as their codename. As commander, your job is to lead these tactical dolls to victory and defend humanity from a group of rogue tactical dolls from the company Sangvis Ferry. GFL's storytelling manages to hit most of the beats: clear settings, some main characters weren't quickly introduced to at the start, and a decent plot. But one of its most glaring flaws is the movement of the story. The early story may not actually feel choppy, but it certainly feels like it. And while games like Arknights and Fate Grand Order follow the same visual novel style, with cutscenes before and after the stage, it feels a lot easier to get hooked to the characters those games introduce to you. This might just be a consequence of GFL's earlier writing being less than stellar, as newer events like Longitudinal Strain introduce the relevant characters better and get you hooked into the current plot. But without the actual content that completing the campaign stages actually gives you, there's a lot going on that you won't have the context for. There's also a few other minor issues, like with how many dolls in the game's roster, even the 4 main dolls you get introduced to at the beginning of the game have trouble getting enough screen time, save for M4A1, who the plots end up revolving around most of the time. And while it's not necessarily a bad thing to have a main sidekick to the player protagonist, like with MASH and FGO or Amiya and Arknights, in Girls Frontline, the focus is more around M4 and the issues surrounding her. In Fate Grand Order's case, the story centers around relationships the player and MASH make. Neither Amiya nor MASH feel too overpowering when it comes to the stories of their respective games, whereas M4, being so important to the plot, makes it hard to give adequate screen time to other characters like Sotmod, and depriving us of the opportunity to connect with them more. Gameplay can roughly be split into 3 main parts: combat, preparation, logistics, and base management. Important to the logistics part of the game are the 4 main resources at the top of the screen. See those big numbers? Is that a lot of resources or too little? I have no idea, and it highlights something Girls Frontline and other gacha games tend to both struggle with and take advantage of: scarcity. Basic resources like ammo, manpower, and such are often gifted to you in such large quantities that it becomes difficult to judge what is an adequate amount of them to maintain, which can sometimes lead to perceived or actual shortages. On the other hand, things like TDL contracts and events take significant advantage of scarcity, with the latter being time-limited, and the earlier required for gacha pulls. It's a puzzle! Girls Frontline makes very good usage of modularity. A lot of the game's core systems are actually small and seemingly simple puzzles, which come together to result in a surprisingly complex game. Let's go over the basic game first. As discussed earlier, the gameplay can be roughly split into combat, logistics, and base management. Base management isn't actually too important for our discussion, so we'll ignore it for today. Before entering combat, the player needs to have echelons prepared. These echelons usually consist of up to 5 tactical dolls, with each one having a unique skill and a set of tiles they buff. We'll call this first puzzle Position Tetris. Each tactical doll has a different positioning configuration, and depending on the class of the tactical doll standing on that improved tile, that doll may receive bonuses like improvements to damage or accuracy. These tiles can overlap, giving specific dolls bonuses from 2 other dolls simultaneously. The challenge is trying to find a good layout for positioning Tetris. This can involve a lot of trial and error, and testing which dolls have the best buffs for which tiles and trying to make them line up well. The second puzzle is the actual combat itself. Girls Frontline is a turn-based game, meaning player and enemy actions happen in alternating turns. Each stage you start with a limited number of action points, usually 1 plus the number of echelons you have deployed. The most basic objective is to capture the enemy base. You can move echelons to a tile and hold said tile until the start of an enemy turn in order to capture it. Capturing helipad tiles gives you an extra action point per helipad tile you control. If an enemy tile is completely surrounded by your tiles, it is encircled and becomes captured at the end of an enemy's turn. The reverse is also true for you, so take care to prevent your echelons from being cut off. The additional difficulty comes from achieving secondary objectives in order to improve the mission rating. Getting A and S rank ratings can improve the end of stage reward, so they're usually worth the trouble. Achieving A rank usually requires capturing all the tiles, while achieving S rank usually requires killing a certain number of enemies and reaching the enemy base before a specific number of turns. The basic simplicity of these systems help mask their collective complexity, making it easier to grasp for first-time players. For players looking to achieve S rank, the challenge of doing so can actually immerse them more than the story, at least in my experience. Before we move on, we have to go back and touch on one thing: combat effectiveness. It's a little muddy how the number is calculated, but it's supposed to take the T-Doll's stats into account and give you a number you can compare against the enemies to figure out how strong your echelon is. This is a poor usage of chunking, and for one big reason: it's not very useful, especially on later stages. An echelon made up of handgun and rifle type T-Dolls, which have a low rate of fire, won't be very effective against lots of tiny enemies, even if they're around the same combat effectiveness. Likewise, an echelon made up of assault rifles and SMGs, which sacrifice damage per rate of fire, will often perform poorly against armored enemies. Effectively, the levels, stats, and your position Tetris matter more than the combat effectiveness number, and you'll find your echelons dying more often if you rely on it. Now for some of the little stuff. Iconic representation is used extensively to add with the questionable legibility of some of the words on the menus. The picture superiority effect is taken advantage of through low helpful comics, which can often appear on loading screens during long updates. And good use of the exposure effect means you can't go more than 5 seconds without seeing a T-Doll. Unless you've done something weird. Girls Frontline and its upcoming sequel are both free to play, so I encourage you to give them a try. It's fairly easy to pick up and put down the original game, and there's not a lot of other games in the same niche. In contrast, Girls Frontline 2 is more of an XCOM style strategy game, so if you're into XCOM with anime girls, go right ahead. I gotta go play with Best Girl again. Well, see you around.